and what it taught you about not only your trauma, but the road back to healing.
Yeah, it's definitely part of my story and part of why I am doing and offering what I offer now. And, my initial trauma would have been in my primary years because my biological father died of cancer just before I was 2. And so I knew I carried that trauma with me, but I couldn't feel or access that trauma. From what I had read about early childhood trauma, I had all the telltale signs and symptoms of it, but I couldn't touch into it. It just seemed like a memory or watching a movie or something along those lines. So at age 35, when I say my life imploded in on me, there were a few experiences and events that piled on top of one another. So I had, without going into the details of it all, I had attended a birth at that time that rocked me to my core, and shattered that identity of, being a traditional birth attendant. Everything that I had studied and learned felt challenged. And so it was a real collapse of one's ego and identity that I had been building for over 10 years by then. And so that was a profound experience, that was kind of the top trauma that cracked everything open. And on top of that, I was just beginning the process of a separation and divorce, with 3 still quite young children. And I had lived in poverty line, low income, raising my children in that bracket for their entire lives. And so the whole financial insecurity of being a stay-at-home mom, a homeschooling mom, an earth mother, a granola kind of mama person, who, on the side would support moms in birth, but, it was never where I earned a living. It was a passion practice. I just had no idea how I was going to survive all of those things that were coming in, crashing in. There were multiple identities crashing. My identity as a mother was crashing. My identity as a birth worker was crashing. My identity as a wife was crashing. And, I had no career to fall back on for financial security. And in all of that, I lost my community too. I was kind of got humiliated and outed from my community at that time. So that was a lot. And it resulted in what we might call the dark night of a soul, because I didn't recognize myself. And I write about this in my book, Midwifery for the Soul, because, it was the first time that I really started to dance with darkness, you could say. And I really went into the underworld and experienced the underworld, in its very traditional senses of like sex, drugs, and rock and roll, you could say, right? And so, in talking about relationships and things like that, I experienced all kinds of challenging relational dynamics as well during that time. What I want to say about it is I knew enough to know that I was completely falling apart and being cracked open. And I knew that because of my profound trust in physiology and biology, which has been with me my whole life, which is so curious, even just studying athletics and being a former college athlete myself, and I just always trusted in the intelligence of our biological system. And I sensed that to find myself and heal from what was happening to my system, that there must be a different way than the more traditional mental health way, where I'd be diagnosed and probably prescribed medications. And I really didn't want to go down that path. But I had hit a point where I couldn't do it alone anymore. And the traditional practices of, different, maybe alternative spiritual healing methods, they weren't working for me. And I say that it felt like my brain was cracked. And because I could not hold a sentence, I could not formulate a thought, I was uncontrollably raging. I was really out of character, and I knew that, and I was scared. Somebody like myself that likes to talk about stuff. The fact that I couldn't actually talk about anything that was longer than maybe a 2-minute attention span. And it took so much effort, and I'd be exhausted by it afterwards. Like, I knew I was suffering from PTSD. And so that's when I started to research PTSD and neurobiology at the same time. And this was before polyvagal theory came on the map. This was before Gabor Mate got famous. This was before the wisdom of trauma came out, right? This was still, trauma was still something we weren't talking about. And so I was as determined as I was in my birthing experiences. I was determined to heal physiologically and neurobiologically and soulfully and emotionally from my trauma. And so what followed after that, what has been my journey of recalibrating and, what I say, going from the wounded to the wise and integrating. Through that integration process, that's really what has led me to develop the flowing fears process, for example, that we might talk about today. It really has come out of my own trials and tribulations of applying trauma-informed concepts of healing to my, excuse me, to my own journey, and seeing what worked and what didn't work. And then over time, realizing, oh, I don't just like all of a sudden weave all the pieces back together again, and I'm like, fine. What happens is we still get activated and triggered. Trauma triggers can come in at any time, and we actually can't predict when, where, how. And they're so destabilizing when they do. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this because I think it's actually important. And so when, for example, there was this moment, this like precipice, is that the word? Precipitous moment when I had, I was back out there. I had already written my book. I was feeling like I had woven some of these pieces together and really experienced some good healing work. And I was still struggling with some deep insecurities that were still hooked in. And I knew it was like, there's still something else. Like, I just knew. It was like, there's still something missing. And it felt like it was on the spiritual, soulful plane, And it's like, okay, I got my brain back physiologically, and I've got some skills in my back pocket, and I can manage life well enough. And I'm in a healthy relationship now. So it's like, okay, I've got things here, but something was still unsettled. And I had presented to a group of people. I think there are about 30 healthcare workers. And typically I love presenting and, but I often still struggle with an insecurity or an imposter complex and all of that stuff. And after this event, there was one question that somebody in the audience had asked me. It wasn't a bad question, but that question triggered something in me. And when I got home that evening, it was as if darkness and a shadow just overwhelmed me. And my nervous system was so activated. And my husband was home at the time. And I remember so clearly being in the kitchen. And it was as if the walls were kind of coming in on me. Everything was coming in on me, closing in on me, right? And I went from, what is that, divergent to convergent, right? Where it's like all of a sudden this narrow focus, and the sounds started to get loud and they were swishing around. And I had to like hang on to the countertop. And my husband didn't know what was happening. I knew what was happening, and I had to close my eyes, and all I could hear were the deepest, darkest thoughts that the only way out of what it was that I was experiencing was to die. And I had been there before, right? I had courted that inner voice of, the ideation of I'd be better off not being here. And so that came back loud, and it shocked me and surprised me. And at the same time as this dark looming shadow, everything coming in on me, my nervous system being so activated, if, one could say I was having a panic attack, right? Like I don't like to just label those things, because what does that actually mean? How are you actually experiencing that panic attack, right? Well, here I am in this state, and I guess that would meet the criteria of a panic attack. And I'm hearing on one side that the darkest of dark thoughts, and really, really struggling with it, like really wanting to out myself, like to just, I'm done, right? On the other side, I'm hearing, Jen, you know what you need to do. You know it. And I felt the tug of war. And it was this moment in time where I understood that I had a decision. I had a choice. Up until that point, I don't think I was conscious enough to know that I had a choice. Mm-hmm. And it was that choice moment in which I had to consciously redirect my energy and attention and apply the knowledge that I had been gathering. And that was like a game-changing moment for me. And I understand, like working with lots of clients, I understand that is the hardest moment, is when we're in what I would call the shitstorm. And our typical pattern is to just be swept away by that shitstorm. And then we're exhausted afterwards, and then we're calling all of our friends, and we're just like, we're not sure if we're going to make it through this time, right? And we're just in the crisis, and it's just swirling and twirling around us, right? Like a tornado. And I call that the trauma tornado. And it was this moment of, even in the trauma tornado, I could do something different. And I did. I did something radically different. And I redirected my energy and attention. And in that moment, I actually tracked every step of the way of what I did to get myself out. And that became the process, the 10-step process in the Flowing Fears process. And then I just kept applying it every time. I applied it to myself. And then I started to apply it with my clients with results. And then I just kind of, slowly tweaked it a little bit here, a little bit there. But it changed the trajectory.
I so appreciate this conversation, because it's again very personal, and it's not a theoretical thing you're talking about. You touched on a very kind of subtle point, that kind of choice point that everyone kind of eventually encounters if they go through that dark night.